Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Super Resolution Microscopy, Capturing the Nano-World. I am Cassie Soltman of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Teledyne Photometrics. To learn more, visit www.photometrics.com, or you can click on the Contact Us button on the bottom right. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. You may also submit any technical issues here as well if you're having any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation. I'd like to now welcome our speakers, Dr. Matthew Kose-Dunn, Marketing Manager with Teledyne Photometrics, and our guest speaker, Professor Anna-Karin Gustavsson, Assistant Professor at the Department of Chemistry at Rice University. Matthew, you may now begin your portion of the presentation.
Hello and welcome to another Teledyne Photometrics webinar with me, Dr. Matthew Kose-Dunn. Today's webinar is all about super resolution microscopy and how to capture the nano-world, featuring guest speaker, Professor Anna-Karin Gustavsson. First, a bit about us at Teledyne Photometrics. We design and manufacture high-end cameras for scientific research. These cameras support demanding quantitative life and physical sciences research. We're a market leader for scientific CMOS technology, and we're established in 1978 and part of the Teledyne Imaging Group since 2019. On our webinar today is me, Dr. Matthew Kose-Dunn, Marketing Manager at Photometrics, and our guest speaker, Professor Anna-Karin Gustavsson of Rice University, Texas. She is a professor of chemistry and Norman Hackerman Welch Young Investigator. Her research focuses on the development and application of 3D single molecule tracking and super resolution imaging throughout mammalian cells. As our subject today is super resolution imaging and all of its various flavors, I'm very grateful to Professor Gustavsson for sharing her wisdom and experiences on these topics today, later in the webinar. But firstly, what is super resolution microscopy and why do we need it? Super resolution microscopy techniques aim to overcome the diffraction limit of light in microscopy. The diffraction limit of light was first described by Ernst Abbe in the late 19th century, and it's described as follows. So this is the equation for the diffraction limit of light in terms of microscopy, where d is the minimum resolvable distance between 2 points in a sample when a microscope is used. This minimum resolvable distance is approximately half the wavelength of the light used, shown here by lambda, divided by the numerical aperture, Na, of the objective lens. Wavelengths and microscope objective lenses can vary wildly depending on technique, but I am going to assume a standard visible light wavelength between 400 to 700 nanometers and the best possible currently available numerical aperture of 1.4 to 1.7. For context, the numerical aperture basically describes how much light in terms of an angle the lens can aim at the subject. So the better the numerical aperture, the better the overall maximum spatial resolution of your imaging system. Using some example values in a best case scenario where 600 nanometers is also where silicon-based scientific cameras are the most sensitive, we can calculate a diffraction limit of around 200 nanometers. This means that resolving details smaller than around 200 nanometers is affected by the diffraction limit, and high-resolution imaging beneath this scale is challenging to achieve. Conventional microscopy is diffraction limited to around 200 to 300 nanometers, and even less axially. This limits researchers' ability to image samples below this scale on the nanoscale. This includes subcellular details, viruses, proteins, molecules, and a whole world of vital detail on the nanoscale. Super resolution microscopy techniques aim to break this diffraction limit and image these smaller samples. The development of super resolution techniques has revolutionized imaging in the life sciences, revealing more and more detail about smaller and smaller structures every year. As an example of the impact of super resolution, you can see here in our image, we have the conventional imaging result. This here is a giant unilamina vesicle. The conventional image in black and white shows that you're quite diffraction limited and can't pick up the details in the ring. But the super resolution technique, shown in orange, picks up extremely fine details beneath the diffraction limit, revealing far more information about this sample. There are many different ways to break the diffraction limit, and in this webinar I'm going to cover structured illumination, physical magnification, photon reassignment, fluctuation imaging, and single molecule localization. There are several other techniques for super resolution, such as stared and minflux, that achieve super resolution, but these typically don't make use of 2D area scan cameras. They often use point detectors, so I won't be covering them in this webinar. First is structured illumination microscopy, known as SIM. This uses patterned light to illuminate the sample, rather than using just a wide field spread of light. The patterned light is typically a pattern of lines or dots in a grid. The structure of this grid interacts with the structure of the sample, and this introduces moire fringes containing high-frequency sample information. You can see here from the image, you have the structure of the sample is overlaid with the structure of the illumination, and you end up with these high-frequency fringes. If you ever see two patterns like this crossing over each other, you often see this strange effect, known as moire fringes. Multiple images are acquired with the patterned light in different phases and orientations. So if you move the light pattern around in certain orientations, it changes the frequency of the interface pattern. And by imaging many of these, you can build up more information about the sample. Each image contains different information, and then you computationally process all the images together to construct a super resolution image. SIM typically improves resolution by a factor of 2. So now you can provide spatial resolution down to 100 nanometers. Other advantages of SIM include it's non-invasive and non-destructive. All you're doing is changing the illumination style so it's suitable for live imaging. It's compatible with most typical fluorescent dyes and probes. You can use it on conventional wide-field microscopes with minimal modifications. You're mainly modifying the illumination. And you can extend it into 3D by acquiring Z-stacks with 3D SIM. While SIM is slower than wide field due to the computational processing steps, it is faster than other super resolution techniques that we'll go into later. There are also advanced variants including instant SIM, iSIM, and multifocus SIM, mSIM, and a whole alphabet of different types of SIM, which all improve on imaging speed and efficiency, making SIM quite a popular technique for super resolution imaging. The next category is expansion microscopy. This is a sample preparation technique proposed in 2015. This is physical magnification. This involves embedding your samples into a hydrogel matrix and then isotropically expanding this gel with water. In this manner, samples can be physically expanded 4 to 8 times in size. You simply swell up the sample you have to a larger size within the gel. Now you can do super resolution imaging even with a standard imaging system, because objects that were previously below the diffraction limit are now above it. You've simply made everything in the sample bigger, so you can image it as you normally would, and it's at super resolution. Expansion microscopy typically improves resolution by 4 to 8 times, because your sample can be 4 to 8 times larger, so now you have spatial resolutions in the tens of nanometers. It can be applied to a wide variety of biological samples, and you can pair it with other imaging techniques such as light sheet, which is well suited to large samples, because while you may not have previously had a large sample, once you've made it much bigger, you need imaging techniques that are well suited to imaging these large fields of view. And you can apply this in 3D because you've expanded the sample in 3D. It's expanded equally in all directions. However, there are several points to consider. If you label your sample with fluorophores before the expansion and it spreads out, they're now much further apart and you have a low fluorophore density, so you may struggle for signal. You may need to label after you expand your sample. It's not typically compatible with live imaging because in order for the cell to expand, you have to cleave the proteins, and the cell has to be embedded in a gel and physically swollen up, so it's not as relevant to live cells. There are also potential distortions that can occur during expansion if your sample expands more in one direction than another. And as I said, you need a suitable imaging system to cope with imaging much larger samples and a suitable camera to avoid lots of tiling and scanning and excessive light dose that comes with that. You just need a big, fast, large field of view camera. The next technique is photon reassignment, one form of which is adapted from spinning disk confocal microscopy, originally proposed as imaging scanning microscopy. So with confocal microscopes, you have 2 point spread functions, or PSFs, one for the pinholes at illumination and one at the pinholes for imaging. These 2 point spread functions are offset. You can see them here, the illumination on the left and the imaging on the right. The actual image comes from the narrower effective point spread function in between. Because this point spread function is narrower, it's at a higher spatial resolution compared to the other point spread functions. If you can computationally reassign the detected photons to their actual point of origin, which is the effective PSF, you can get an increase in spatial resolution. You can even optically reassign the photons by using an additional layer of microlenses underneath the confocal pinhole disk, the one outlined in red here. This new array of microlenses underneath the pinholes can optically reassign the photons to the correct PSF. This kind of photon reassignment typically improves resolution by a factor of 2, providing spatial resolutions of 100 nanometers, similar to SIM. Other advantages include the speed and optical sectioning abilities of the confocal are maintained. The confocal can still image at high speed, up to 200 frames a second with high-speed disks. You can use it with the same range of live samples and fluorophores as you would normally, and you have the choice of doing it computationally or optically. While this technique can improve resolution, it is still limited by the implementation and the resolution limit of other components in your system. But having said that, there are several super resolution spinning disk systems available because it's a system that gives you the advantages of both. Another set of techniques involve fluctuation imaging. This is where you analyze temporal fluctuations in the fluorescent signal. And there are 2 I'd like to discuss. There's SOFI, super resolution optical fluctuation imaging, and SURF, super resolution radial fluctuations. SOFI relies on imaging the fluctuating emission from fluorophores, so essentially the changes in fluorescence intensity over time. SURF relies on imaging radial fluctuations, the radial symmetry of PSFs in the emission signal and how that changes. You can see here the comparison of wide field, SURF, and enhanced SURF in this image here. You can improve resolution through both of these methods. Both of these are computational super resolution techniques. Both SOFI and SURF are compatible with standard microscopy systems. They don't require specialized hardware. They can be used to analyze diffraction limited images post-acquisition, and they're simple and accessible approaches to super resolution imaging. For example, SURF is available through ImageJ as NanoJ eSurf. Credit to the Ricardo Enriquez lab. And finally, last but definitely not least, is super molecule localization microscopy, or SMLM. This involves several techniques capable of imaging down to 10 nanometers or smaller, so you get really, really fine details with these pictures. You can see here on the left an image taken with a conventional imaging system, and on the right something with SMLM. Fibers are really good at demonstrating these changes in resolution, so you often see a lot of fibers with super resolution. With SMLM, you have fluorophores that blink on and off in a random or controlled manner depending on the technique. So you can see here a diffraction limited image of an alarm clock, and what you're imaging is blinking fluorophores. You can localize exactly where these fluorophores are, and then you can build up an image from every single point within it, as you can see in the reconstruction. This means that taking the image at a super resolution level requires taking thousands of series of images and then building up the reconstructed image, but it does mean the reconstructed image has a very high resolution, well beyond the diffraction limit. By activating a subset of blinking fluorophores and taking a series of images and repeating this process, every fluorescent point in the image can be captured regardless of density and proximity. Even if two fluorophores are right next to each other, if you image one and then it blinks off and you image the other one, you can separate them temporarily. A super-resolution image is then reconstructed from the localized positions of all activated fluorophores. By temporarily isolating fluorophores in this manner, SMLM techniques can achieve extremely high resolutions. Popular SMLM techniques include PALM, or photoactivated localization microscopy. This is where the fluorophores are inactive until stimulated, so you can activate a small subset, and then excite them, and then you can bleach them to deactivate them, and then repeat. STORM, or stochastic optical reconstruction microscopy, where fluorophores can be excited, and they emit light and then enter a dark state when they can be re-excited. The fluorophore blinking is random, hence stochastic. There's also many variants of STORM, including direct STORM or D-STORM, which uses fluorophores that can cycle between fluorescence and dark state, simplifying imaging and giving higher precision. And there's also point accumulation for imaging in nanoscale topography, or PAINT. This is where binding of complementary DNA strands results in the random blinking. You can see here an image on the right taken with DNA paint. The distance between the bright spots of these origami nanorulers is 40 nanometers, so the resolution is extremely high. Single molecule techniques offer several advantages. You get a nanoscale resolution well beyond the diffraction limit. You can apply them to various biological samples, including live cells. There are a wide range of fluorophores specifically for single molecule available, and it can be extended into 3D. Challenges include the long acquisition times because you have iterative imaging cycles and reconstruction processes. You're quite dependent on fluorophore photophysics, such as how the molecules blink and how they bleach. You have complex analysis with specialized algorithms. You often find each super-resolution lab has its own algorithm it'll be using for reconstruction or analysis, and this can mean differences between them. And the localization precision is entirely dependent on the signal-to-noise ratio, so it's very important that you have a sensitive imaging system and sensitive camera in order to capture the ground truth and not just noise. That's a nice roundup of all of our super-resolution techniques, but these super-resolution and single molecule techniques are wide, varied, and continually advancing. So to this end, let's hear from our guest speaker, Professor Anna-Karin Gustavsson of Rice University, Texas. Professor Gustavsson's research focuses on the development and application of 3D single molecule tracking and super-resolution imaging throughout mammalian cells.
Yeah, so my name is Anna-Karin Gustavsson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry at Rice University in Houston, Texas, in the US. And our research relates to single molecule imaging, both when it comes to tracking of dynamics and super resolution imaging of structures. And we are developing new methods to improve these techniques, working a lot with 3D imaging, and we're also applying these techniques that we develop for various applications in biophysics and biomedicine. Yeah, so single molecule localization microscopy is one way to achieve super resolution imaging or to really circumvent the diffraction limit. There are other methods as well that we like to call deterministic versus stochastic methods, where the single molecule one would be the stochastic version of it, where you have, for example, STED imaging, structured illumination, other approaches that are more deterministic. But there are other ways to circumvent the diffraction limit, but single molecule imaging is one way to do that. That is the method that we are using mostly in our lab. So we custom build our microscope, more or less. We start with a conventional microscope base, but then we add different modules and functionalities depending on what developments we're working on to improve the techniques and what applications we're interested in. So we're working a lot with light sheet illumination, which is a way to optically section the sample to improve fluorescence background, photo bleaching, photo damage. We are adding modules to be able to extract 3D position of single molecules and not just 2D. So I like to see it as a modular kind of development where you can add different modules depending on what functionalities you need. But yeah, and then we utilize a range of different techniques to actually achieve super resolution when it comes to actually controlling, labeling with different fluorophores and how to control which fluorophores are emitting and so on. Depending on what applications, these different techniques are, well, they are useful for different applications. So we use all of them really, depending on what project or problem we're working on. So it could be PALM, which is a photoactivation based technique, STORM, that is a stochastic blinking, or paint, for example, where you rely on binding and unbinding to achieve this blinking that we need for single molecule super resolution imaging. Yeah, so the benefits are really that we gain access to the molecular level information. We want to understand how cells function at the molecular level. And that could be, from a single molecule point of view, it could be tracking of dynamics to see how individual proteins, for example, in a cell, how they're moving, where they're binding, unbinding, maybe interacting with other partners. And on the super resolution imaging aspect is really resolving nanoscale features in the cell. And it could be one target or multiple targets, see also colocalizations and interactions. It could be changes in structures as a function of, say, addition of drugs or during disease progression that we're interested in understanding. So yeah, there are many benefits, but of course also many challenges. As you mentioned, there's continuous push to improve the techniques when it comes to speed, throughput. Typically the single molecule super resolution techniques are quite slow compared to some other methods. You get very nice resolution, but at the cost of temporal resolution. So improving that speed to improve throughput, to make them more gentle, live cell compatible, because that's also been hard. Both that you typically use high laser powers and you need to sample enough data, and so the cell might have time to change and move during the acquisition. So yeah, continuous push, as I said, for speed, making them more gentle, live cell compatible, and when it comes to labeling, there's a big developments going on continuously on new fluorophores, new labeling techniques, also to make them more live cell compatible, for example, brighter, more photostable. And of course, camera developments, analysis algorithm developments, all of that plays a role in how well we can image, really. One problem, I guess, with single molecule imaging is that you depend on collecting as much light as you can from individual molecules. So you also want to have high numerical aperture objectives for detection, but it means a short working distance. And as you move away, yeah, you have multiple different kind of problems as you move away from the cover slip, you move deeper into the sample. As you say, clearing is definitely one, but even just for as few cell layers, you start having problems with light propagating through and propagating out, both when it comes to excitation and emission. So having some adaptive optics approaches to both improve how well you can penetrate into the sample with the excitation light and actually reach the fluorophores of interest, and how distorted the wavefront is of the light that is emitted back towards your camera are two important factors that we are considering. And as I said, we're combining other approaches with light sheet illumination in our lab, where instead of illuminating the entire cell, for example, or entire sample, we introduce a sheet of light to optically section the sample from the side and only illuminate close to the image plane. But of course, that has similar issues with when you're imaging larger structures, right? If you want to penetrate deep into the sample, it will become aberrated, scattered. So yeah, We haven't ourselves used any two-photon approaches. That is one way. And of course, going to the near IR is where we typically work, preferably anyway, because you have lower autofluorescence from the sample in that regime, which improves the single molecule imaging too. But yeah, these are kind of active fields of research to improve those types of situations. But conventionally, single molecule imaging has been limited to imaging quite close to the cover slip, but that is changing now as well with the improved methods. So. Since we're imaging the light emitted from single molecules, we have a limited photon budget to work with. So we want to detect that as efficiently and in some cases as fast as possible. So we need a high quantum efficiency. Typically in our work, we work with larger pixels, maybe rather than the higher resolution. In some applications, they really want to have, as many pixels as possible. And that could be good in the sense of a large field of view to get a lot of information at the same time. But we also need to gather a lot of light to improve our localization precision, improve the data that we can achieve and detect. Of course, low noise, that goes hand in hand. You want good signal and low background, low noise from the camera. Preferably want it to be fast. Once again, depending on applications, if you have a very low light situation, you need to gather enough photons to actually localize the molecule. But if you have a probe that delivers photons fast enough, you want to be able to utilize that for fast tracking and faster imaging. Another thing that I think it's important is the hardware-software interface. How well can we communicate with the cameras? Because that could be another hurdle otherwise if we can't incorporate it into the rest of the setup, so to say, in the control and data extraction. And that becomes even more important the faster and more information you get, that you can kind of fast access that data. In some cases, it's enough to do all the analysis in post-processing. You simply save the data and the next day you can analyze it in post-processing. In some cases, we actually do want some live analysis on the fly, online analysis. It could be for drift correction, it could be for keeping a sample in the field of view, it could be many different things where you actually need the information that is in the images during the actual image acquisition and update some parameters based on what do you see. And yeah, once again, continuous developments on image analysis algorithms coming at hand. Deep learning and neural nets are becoming important players as well, both when it comes to post-processing analysis, but also as fast tools for online on real-time analysis. Yeah, as I said, some of these parameters we've already touched upon, like quantum efficiency, noise, speed, compatibility or with software and that hardware-software interface and communication, all really matters to us. Of course, we want them to be user-friendly and especially for more and more people to be able to use them. Easily calibrated, and that comes into play. For example, we use both SCMOS cameras and EMCCDs in the lab, where EMCCDs are maybe the more conventional super resolution or single molecule cameras, but SCMOS technology has advanced so well, so it's coming more and more into the single molecule labs as well, and especially when it comes to pushing speeds, for example, going faster. Overall, what we and I think most people strive for in the field are really, faster, more gentle, multimodal. You may want to get correlative information about both dynamics and structures, multi-target, reduced aberrations, improved analysis algorithms. It could be combinations with adaptive optics. So yeah, it's a lot of different factors, a lot of different improvements that we're still working on, and that will improve the situation even more. But different applications have different demands. So a little bit depending on what applications you're striving for and working on, these matters more or less. So going deeper into cells, for example, deeper into samples, tissues, organoids, you will run into aberrations, and how fast can you correct for those aberrations, or can you account for them in post-processing? Preferably you want to do it on the fly, right? You actually use that information fully. So yeah, it's a lot of different fronts to push on, and yeah, camera technology is definitely one of those. And as I said, fluorophore developments, labeling approaches, analysis algorithms, together with, of course, optical developments, all play a role.
Thanks very much to Professor Anna-Karin Gustavsson for taking us through her experience in super resolution and single molecule techniques. We've been talking a lot about spatial resolution in terms of super resolution. And while these super resolution techniques can break the diffraction limit, your imaging system has spatial resolution limits of its own. These are determined by two main factors: the camera resolution and the microscope resolution. As we discussed, the microscope resolution is dependent on the wavelength you're imaging at and the numerical aperture of your objective lens, while the camera resolution is dependent on the camera sensor pixel size divided by the total magnification. So for example, this is what the camera sensor would see for two objects. You can see here that you've clearly defined between two objects, your resolution is high enough, and you can see them separately between the camera pixels. With the example on the right, we can't tell if this is one or two objects. This is at the Rayleigh limit. Essentially, the camera is too low resolution to pick out any detail here. The pixel size is likely too large. In order to pick between these two objects, you'd need a smaller pixel size, which would allow you to sample more frequently. The equivalent of this in the microscope looks like this. You effectively have an airy disk, and you can see that you have two clear objects, and on the right you have an unclear number of objects. It could be one or two. You can see the disks have overlapped here, and you can't quite determine what's going on. You'd need a higher resolution, perhaps imaging at a longer wavelength or with a better objective. The resolution of your entire imaging system is limited by the worst component. If you have an extremely high resolution camera, but you're using a very poor microscope objective, you're not going to be able to make the most of that system. When aiming for optimal resolution, it's best to match Nyquist. Nyquist sampling is the general theory that your sampling rate should be double the smallest object that you have. So if you have a sample where the smallest feature is around 10 nanometers, ideally you'd be able to sample every 5 nanometers. Depending on which is higher, the camera resolution or the microscope resolution, you may be oversampling versus undersampling. And both of these have their own benefits and drawbacks. The main point here is that you should match the camera resolution to your microscope resolution to ensure that you're not limiting the resolution of your whole system. So super resolution techniques achieve optimal resolution only when paired with an ideal camera solution. Pixel size is very important, and it's vital to match this in magnification. Typical camera pixel sizes include 4 micron, 6.5 micron, and 11 micron. These correspond to 40x, 60x, and 100x magnification. That's why pixel camera sizes are so specific. They're being matched to specific magnifications that most imaging systems use: 10x, 20x, 40x, 60x, 100x. You can do binning to make your camera's pixel bigger, but it's best to match the pixel size of the camera to the magnification you're most likely to use. In general, modern SCMOS cameras remove bottlenecks in imaging. They have larger fields of view, better signal-to-noise ratio, and higher speeds. And you can image without compromise with teledyne photometrics. We're going to take you through some of our best camera solutions for super resolution imaging. Here we have the Kinetics, the Prime 95B, and the Prime BSI Express. We're going to take you through each of these products now. The Kinetics aims to image without compromise. Typical CMOS cameras can be limited in their speed, field of view, and sensitivity. What if you want to go faster? Are you failing to capture certain dynamic events? What if you could image bigger? Can you capture enough data in one frame? And what if you could reduce noise? Is your low light sample hard to see? The Kinetics is designed to remove these bottlenecks. It is faster, bigger, and more sensitive. So the Kinetics is the next generation of SCMOS camera. It operates at extreme speeds across a very large sensor and with sub-electron sensitivity. It also comes with liquid cooling, so you don't have a vibration issue from the air cooling fan. The Kinetics is 8 times faster and 2.5 times larger compared to a typical CMOS, and has been used for a wide variety of super resolution applications by researchers across the globe. Discussing the field of view, you can see an EMCCD here in red and a typical CMOS in purple, with the Kinetics 22 in green and the full Kinetics in blue at 29mm. Because you have a higher throughput, you have more data in every single frame. That means you don't need to tile or stitch across your sample. You don't need to take multiple images. Every single image you take has more information in it. You don't need to take as many images. Your imaging experiments are over faster, and your sample has less light dose. You can also pair it with a splitter for simultaneous multi-dimensional imaging. You can split the Kinetics up to 4, and you could do 4 wavelengths or 4 different focal planes. And if your microscope can't go as large as 29, we have the Kinetics 22, which is optimized for the systems with a smaller maximum field of view. But in general, the more you can capture, the more you've optimized your data rate. Sensitivity. These cameras require high signals and low noise to get the biggest signal-to-noise ratio possible. So the signal collection is a near-perfect 96% quantum efficiency at peak, and it stretches all the way from the UV to the near-infrared. The noise sources are all minimized, so there's no patterning, there's no artifacts, and with sub-electron mode, the read noise is at sub-electron levels, at 0.7 electrons. As a result, Kinetics cameras are highly sensitive and can detect even the weakest of samples. There's also speed. The Kinetics images at 500 frames a second across the full 29mm field of view. This is 8 times faster than typical CMOS cameras at a standard 18mm field of view. And because it's a CMOS camera, every time you half the frame, you double the speed, so you can achieve extreme speeds with small regions, over 100 kHz. With faster imaging, you can see what you are missing in your sample. This is only possible due to high sensitivity. If you want to image at 1,000 frames a second, your exposure time needs to be 1 millisecond. So you need to be able to collect all the data you need in 1 millisecond in order to image this fast. So the camera can only be fast because it is sensitive. And as a bonus, this all happens in an 8-bit mode, so your files are half the size. A typical CMOS would capture 500 frames a second in around this field, whereas the Kinetics would capture it in this field, so you get the same speed with an 11 times larger area. But importantly for super resolution, there are other speed benefits. So the line time of the Kinetics in speed mode is 625 nanoseconds. This is how long it takes to read out each line. These make imaging far more effective even with slower samples. And this is all done with rolling shutter, but we also have pseudo-global shutter regimes. So with rolling shutter, the Kinetics has a lower frame time, less light dose, and you get more efficient imaging. With pseudo-global shutter, you get less dark time. We can look at the difference between these two. Here is an example of how a fast rolling shutter can benefit your imaging. On the left we have the Kinetics, on the right we have a typical CMOS. Both of them are being exposed for 10 milliseconds, but because the Kinetics has such a fast line time, the sample is exposed to less light, as we can see now. The typical CMOS has exposed the sample to light for much longer because the line time is slower. So even though they have both the same exposure time, The kinetics uses 2.5 times less light while achieving the same exposure. This means there's less light dose and you can keep your cells alive for longer. There's also pseudo-global shutter. So the kinetics and prime families all use rolling shutter readouts for high speeds. This graph here shows the time difference between imaging the top row and the bottom row. In rolling shutter, you image row by row as you go down through time. So it starts to slant like this, where by the time you've gone through one frame, the next frame is already starting. This allows them to be imaged extremely quickly. The alternative regime is global shutter, where you image all of the rows simultaneously. While the kinetics is a rolling shutter camera, it can achieve a global shutter regime with pseudo-global shutter. Both using hardware triggering, you can achieve this third option of pseudo-global shutter, where you only read out once all the rows can be read out, which is this red area here. The short line time of the kinetics also makes the pseudo-global shutter far more efficient. While a typical CMOS might look like this in pseudo-global, where the longer line time leads to more time when the camera is off, or dark time, the kinetics is much faster and looks more like this. The fast line time results in lower time between frames, more time is spent exposing instead of waiting, and you get much higher signal and greater signal-to-noise ratio, up to 6 times greater. Whether you're using rolling shutter or pseudo-global shutter, just by having a very fast line time, you get so many benefits that aren't immediately obvious. And so kinetic speed results in more efficient imaging for all application types. Here's some examples of the kinetics at work for super-resolution imaging. This is ISIM imaging on live cells from Dr. Dan Dickinson of Texas. The Kinetics 22 has a uniform background, high sensitivity, and low read noise, so you can easily collect enough photons to make really precise measurements. Here's the kinetics using D-Storm with Dr. Alexander Fürstenberg of Geneva. He's imaging these giant unilamellar vesicles we saw earlier, and the kinetics can image the entire thing in one frame. This removes any issues with positioning, and you can go very fast and image very efficiently. And lastly, we have expanded light sheet with Professor Ulrich Kubitschek. He is combining light sheet microscopy and expansion microscopy to image neuronal tissues in super resolution. He's also put together this comparison for us. In tile A, we can see a typical CMOS took 10 tiles to image this sample, while in area B, you can see the kinetics took 2 tiles. Because the field of view is so much larger, it's so much more efficient. And you can see if you look at C and D, even at high magnification, you still retain very high resolution detail. So the large sensor combined with the small pixel size really allows you to maximize data capture, all with an excellent signal-to-noise ratio. Ideal for the large samples you're going to get with expansion microscopy. Next up is the Prime 95B. The Prime 95B has a really big pixel. The kinetics at a 6.5 micron pixel. The Prime 95 is 11 micron. So this is really good for high magnification imaging. It also goes up to a maximum field of view of 25 mm and has a similar high quantum efficiency as well as liquid cooling. The Prime 95B was also the world's first back-illuminated CMOS camera back in 2016. It has a very high QE and a low noise, a large pixel, multiple field of view options, but it comes with additional advanced software features. These include Prime Enhance, an actively noising technique, and Prime Locate, which we can see in the GIF here, which is data reduction and live particle tracking. Here's the Prime 95B used for multi-channel storm imaging with Professor Eli Rothenberg of New York University. This is storm with multiple colors to localize and track DNA as it replicates within the cell. They were previously using EMCCDs for this kind of imaging, and the 95B is an excellent alternative to this. You can image faster, you can image across a bigger field of view, and at a higher resolution. This really helps you track kinetics and keep your imaging at a high quality. 95B was also used in Live Cell Sim by Dr. Guy Hagen, who was a developer of Thunderstorm and Sim Toolbox. The 95B allowed him to image twice as fast as previous EMCCD solutions and at much lower pixel-to-pixel and column variance due to the lower pattern noise, which really increases image quality. And also here's the 95B in confocal storm. You can see here Dr. Yuri Manna did a direct comparison between the 95B and EMCCDs, and you can see that at a low exposure and a low laser intensity, you still get a much better image quality with the 95B, along with a faster speed and a bigger field of view. Lastly is the Prime BSI Express. This has a similar pixel size to the Kinetics at 6.5 and retains a high quantum efficiency, high speed, and low read noise. And this one comes with a compact form factor. It's been widely used for super resolution as well. The Prime BSI Express is highly flexible, compact, and powerful, and is easily integrated into existing systems or OEM devices. It's an ideal solution for the majority of imaging applications, especially super resolution, but due to the smaller form factor, it's only air cooling. If you do need a greater speed, larger sensor, higher sensitivity, or liquid cooling, the Kinetics family are available. The Prime BSI Express is widely used in super resolution. Here's an example from Professor David Klenneman's lab, University of Cambridge, where they used the Prime BSI Express for DNA paint. The low noise and small 6.5 micron pixel are ideal for high resolution imaging. The Prime BSI Express has quickly become one of the most robust parts of the imaging system. Professor Helge Ewers is using the BSI Express for spinning disk expansion microscopy. The large chip allows you to realize the gains in resolution with the small pixel size, and the results are stunning, as Professor Ewers says. And lastly, the BSI Express has also been used for super resolution spinning disk by Dr. Delgado Martins. They needed a sensitive camera in order to reduce exposure time and illumination intensity to reduce bleaching. Along with the high speed and high sensitivity, the BSI Express allows this research group to do super resolution spinning disk work with even the weakest of samples. In summary, these are our camera offerings for super resolution imaging: the Kinetics, Prime 95B, and Prime BSI Express. Here's a brief rundown of the specifications for those who are interested. In general, we keep the read noises low, the quantum efficiency high, the pixel size varied, the array size and field of view large, and the speed high as well. In summary, super resolution imaging allows researchers to break the diffraction limit of light and image smaller and smaller samples. While there are many methods to achieve super resolution, high-resolution SCMOS cameras are vital to maintain overall system resolution and sensitivity. And with the Kinetics family, there's no need to compromise. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar today. I'd love to take any questions you have at this time.
Thank you, Matthew and Anna-Karin, for your informative presentations. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located in the lower left corner of your screen. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for today. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first question that we have here asks, are there turnkey sub-assemblies available for techniques such as STORM that can be added to standard wide field or confocal microscopes?
Great question. Essentially, you can convert some microscopes to microscopes that are capable of super resolution imaging if it's a kind of super resolution imaging that you just benefit from by changing the way that the light path works, for instance. So there's something called Deep Sim, I think, that Quest Optics have, where it's essentially a modular add-on for a system that allows you to do sim and image at super resolution levels. An add-on that would do STORM, it would be requiring you to change your fluorophore more than adding something onto the assembly, because STORM is more dependent on the way that the fluorophore blinks. So if you wanted a sub-assembly that you could sort of just add onto your system and then make it a super resolution system, it'll have to be super resolution methods that are based around the way the microscope works as opposed to the way the fluorophore works. So yeah, there's definitely some solutions for things like SIM. Solutions for things like STORM, they may exist, but I'm not sure. As for the confocal microscope, you can convert it into a super resolution confocal microscope with the micro lenses. But there's also systems like the Yokogawa Sora and things like that. They do super resolution with a spinning disk. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, you can have some sub-assemblies that give you super resolution, but not others, essentially.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, and again, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please do so in that lower left corner for Ask a Question. Let me see here. We have another one that just popped in that asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of super resolution?
Yeah, so the advantages is that you get to see smaller samples, essentially. The reason you have super resolution is because with normal microscopy, you can't see below roughly 200 nanometers, thanks to the diffraction limit of light. So the advantage is you get to see samples below that level. And as you can imagine, for things like looking at viruses and determining viral structures during the coronavirus pandemic, it was very important to have systems that are able to image viruses and see what kind of structure they have, what are the spike proteins, what kind of structure does the envelope have. You couldn't do that without super resolution. So that's the major advantage. The disadvantages are that some of the systems can be quite technically difficult to use. You need some training in order to use some of these systems. Some of them can be quite expensive, so it can be a little bit inaccessible. There are some super resolution systems like SURF where you can essentially do it computationally. And with things like AI, I imagine eventually there's going to be systems where you can convert standard images to what a super resolution version of that image may look like. But this is another disadvantage, essentially, because at a certain point, you don't know if what you're seeing is the truth of what your sample actually looks like at a super resolution level, or if you're looking at something that is generated by the algorithm that you have. And groups that use super resolution very frequently often have their own algorithms to sort of refine how the image looks. If you're sampling at Nyquist, you can have oversampling to try and pull more resolution out of your image. But does that change what the image is like compared to how the sample is? You can't be sure because the information on what the sample is like is coming from the microscope. So there's definitely a lot of caveats to consider when you're using super resolution, but because there's so many different ways to do it now, I'm certain that there are some systems which are suitable for everyone, and then everyone gets to benefit from the advantages of seeing samples they couldn't see before.
Excellent, well said. All right, our next question here, the question says, this technology, can it also be used with immunofluorescence?
Yeah, essentially, most of these are simply a different version of wide field fluorescence microscopy. Where we say wide field microscopy is simply bathing the image of light, but then I'm talking about it in a sort of fluorescence angle where you're getting a fluorescence back from the sample. So something like SIM, you're looking at fluorescence images most of the time. The same with the rest of the techniques. Because you need contrast in order to benefit from the higher resolution capabilities of your system, they're often exclusively used with fluorescence, especially with things like GFP, and you can treat your samples and add fluorophores and then get samples with only work with certain fluorophores like Storm and Palm. So yeah, the technology is very compatible with fluorescence.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, and it looks like that is all of the questions that we have at the moment, unless anybody submits any. I want to thank you again, Matthew, for your time today and your important research. Oh, looks like we just got another question pop in, if you don't mind answering that one for our audience.
Of course.
Okay. The major role of transmission electron microscopy and super resolution microscopy is both or not? If both, why do we need super resolution microbiology?
Yes, a good question. So super resolution is essentially here to image smaller samples than you could with normal microscopy. But as you say, the same thing is achieved with electron microscopy. You can image even smaller still. down to the atomic scale, even with some systems. So electron microscopy definitely gives you the same benefits of super resolution microscopy. But I imagine the number of people who have a traditional fluorescence imaging system that can then be converted into a super resolution system is far more than the number of people who have access to an electron microscope, for example. I think if electron microscopy was as easy to access as common wide field or fluorescence microscopy is, then more people would be using it for this kind of thing. One disadvantage, I would say, is that electron microscopy often needs to sputter coat your sample with all sorts of contrast agents, and you typically can't do much live imaging. Whereas with biology, it's really important to be biologically relevant and image live samples and image in 3D to get something that's more realistic of what the sample's real life would be like, as opposed to sort of like a 2D slice where you've quite harshly treated the sample. It will give you a higher resolution, but is the image you're getting biologically relevant? So you're definitely right that electron microscopy will give you a similar result, if not much, much higher resolution, but it's also quite a lot harsher to the sample and a lot more inaccessible to some groups. If you have the ability to use it, it definitely gives you a highly, highly magnified image at a very high quality. But maybe this isn't suitable for some groups that are using live samples, for example.
Excellent. Thank you. We would love to take any additional questions. We are nearing the end of our live broadcast time frame, though, so any questions that come in after this point will be answered by our speaker via the contact information you provided. So again, I want to thank you for your time today. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Teledyne Photometrics, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. This webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.